Partnership for Observing Global Ocean, POGO committee, which Howard set up and was one of the chairmen of. So after retiring from being the director of the National Oceanography Centre, which he was from 1999 to 2005, he's been working on the Sargasso Sea Commission, and he was a commissioner of that organisation for 9 years and leading its advisory committee on science. So no better person to talk to us about the Sargasso Sea and its issues and problems than Howard. So thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Phil. That's the nicest things you've ever said about me. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see some familiar faces in the audience, which means that I can divert all the questions on physical oceanography and that sort of stuff to them. So here we go. Okay, well, I thought I usually start these talks by telling you how someone who lives down the road at Barton-on-Sea spent about 12, 14 years of his life on a patch of ocean about 3,000 to 4,000 miles away from Barton-on-Sea. And this slide here summarizes my career, which Phil's already told you about. So here we are, we're doing a spot of dentistry. I've got a thing here. Yeah, that's me doing a spot of dentistry on a sperm whale. I then transferred to the main institute, trundled around on ships at seas. This is a hurricane in the Southern Ocean. I built net systems, I played around with acoustics and optics, all aimed to study the weird and wonderful animals that live in the deep ocean, which so few people have ever had the opportunity to see. I coordinated development of the Oceanography Centre here. I retired as director in 2005. Overlapping with my retirement was supervising the build and delivery of the Royal Research Ship James Cook. And in the course of all this, I went to the Sargasso Sea. But that isn't why I got involved in the politics and conservation. That all came about when I was wandering around in my garden in February, a couple of years after I retired, and I answered the telephone, and I got a very excitable young man on the other end of the phone who said, "Hugo here, Hugo Frost, Foreign Office. Are you doing anything next week?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, there's a meeting in Bermuda, and we'd rather like you to go along and tell us what it's all about." And that's how I started on the Sargasso Sea. But before we go on, you need a bit of context, perhaps. This, I maintain, is the most important photograph that's ever been taken. It was the blue marble. It was the first view of Earth from space taken by the Apollo astronauts in 1972. And it's important for a number of reasons. It showed us that the Earth was blue. It's blue because 71% of it is covered by the sea. Our planet should really be called water, not Earth at all. But more important than that, it started us to think about our place in the scheme of things, because it was quite obvious from these photographs that we live on a rather small planet buzzing around in the void of space, with a clear implication we'd better look after it because there's nowhere else to go. Unfortunately, looking after it we're not very good at, particularly in the sea. And you've got 71% is covered with the sea, 51% is covered by something called the high seas, the areas beyond national jurisdiction. These are the areas with no overall jurisdiction at all. They're outside the continental limits and so on. They're a mixture of sectoral interests, gaps and all sorts of things. It's basically a free-for-all, the freedom of the high seas. And this high seas, 90% or so by volume of our living space is in that 51%. And only about 1.2% of that is protected. And I should say at this point that I put a lot of these slides together a while back, and it's highly likely that some of the numbers, and I'm not going to give you very many numbers, might have been superseded, but the principles remain the same. The equivalent figure for Earth when this was going on was about 14%. And that's why, when I got to Bermuda, there was a curious group of people sitting around in the lab there, looking at me as if I'd just come down from planet Zog. It was a mixture of Bermudan civil servants, NGO people, international lawyers. The one group that was spectacularly absent was anybody who knew anything about science. And what they were doing was another group a year or so previously had identified the Sargasso Sea as an area of sea that might be worth thinking about conserving it. And this meeting they were trying to decide how they might do this under the auspices of the government of Bermuda, which was very keen to take a lead on this and show that it was sort of on the front line of international efforts to conserve the open ocean. And out of that meeting, something called the Sargasso Sea Alliance was born, and it was intended to build a network of partners. You shouldn't get that one yet, but when we got it. It was intended to build a network of partners and interested people. It was to tell the world why this was an important place. It was to use that information to help others try to do the same thing. And I was asked to look after the science for this and effectively develop the science case. And in the Sargasso Sea, what most people know about the Sargasso Sea is sort of on this overhead here. It was discovered by Columbus in 1492, and from then on all the myths and legends started. His ships were stuck in mats of weed. He'd never come across weed in the open ocean, and this led to stories of ships being becalmed in mats of weed and spending forever in them without getting out. In 1609, there was a shipwreck on Bermuda, and when the crew eventually got back to London with tales of weird noises and flapping beasts around the island at night, and that stimulated Shakespeare to write The Tempest. And then since then, Jules Verne's got into the act. Bermuda Triangle here. I've no idea who Captain Eli is. And the wide Sargasso Sea looks very interesting, but it's of course nothing to do with Sargasso Sea at all. It's a prequel to Jane Eyre. But you don't need myths and legends because the Sargasso Sea, as I hope I'll be able to tell you, it's actually a very interesting and important place. And that's because of the mixture of its oceanography, its biology, its role in global research and monitoring, and the resources. So, where is it? It's here. This is Africa, this is America, and the Sargasso Sea is this lump of subtropical water in the North Atlantic subtropical gyre. It's the only sea with no land, not bounded by any land. Instead, it's bounded by clockwise rotating currents. To the east, you've got the Azores and Canary currents, which are fairly diffuse. You come round here, the equatorial current, around here, up into the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift. And these currents go round and round and round, trapping a great big body of water here. And because of the currents and because this moves very slowly, once stuff's in there, it tends to stay there. And the area we chose to study in is marked by this red line here. It's to the west of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, to avoid any complications to do with that. And the sort of nibbly outline here is to do with the continental, the limits of the different countries. So that's the area I'm talking about. It's about the same size as the European Commission countries. And this is more or less it from a surface temperature satellite. Here is the Gulf Stream bed doing whirly bits with eddies and whatnot, which have a slight exchange in and out, but that doesn't matter for us today. More important is this red and this green. This is cool water and warm water meeting at something called the subtropical convergence. And in the autumn to spring of each year, thermal fronts are set up here, and those thermal fronts, water piles in on both sides and creates eastward flowing currents. I hope you're paying attention because this matters, is what I'm going to tell you in a minute. And the last thing is the North Atlantic Oscillation. This is the pressure difference at sea level between Iceland and the Azores, and it flips, and I don't know why it flips, but other people in this audience will know that. But when it's positive, you've got westerlies coming up here, warm, wet winters, and in the opposite, it goes down that way. And what it does, it changes the westerly winds, which affect the ocean surface currents, which also affects what I'm going to talk about. So that's the physics bit. And what we're talking about is a sargassum-based ecosystem. Sargassum weed is a very peculiar brown algae. It's holoplanktonic. It spends its entire life drifting around in the ocean. It has no connection with land at all. And it's a golden brown colour. There are 2 species, and it tends to concentrate. Oh God, I keep pressing this, I beg your pardon. It tends to concentrate in windrows and currents, as you saw there. And it's a very peculiar habitat, because in the open ocean there is no structure. And these sargassum mats and windrows and whatnot provide a structure for a peculiar ecosystem all of its own. It's made up of 2 different species. Here they are, Sargassum natans, Sargassum fluviatilis. They're very similar really, and each of them has got lots of different forms, beloved of taxonomists, but that doesn't matter. And within these mats, there is a unique ecosystem. There are something like 150 invertebrate species live in association with these mats, of whom, and there are about 10 endemic species, which live only amongst the sargassum weed. They occur nowhere else on the planet apart from these mats of golden weed. And they're more or less modified in various ways. We've got swimming crab here, you've got a shrimp here, you've got a slug there, a snail there, the sargassum pikefish is lurking in there. The most entertaining one is this chap. It's the sargassum anglerfish, and you can see it's beautifully camouflaged. It's like all anglerfish, it has a very large mouth with big teeth and a little fishing rod on its nose, but its front fins are modified like limbs, and it actually crawls around using these as legs in the weed mats. And if you put one in an aquarium and put your finger anywhere near it, it will come and bite it. But there you go. So you have this unique community sitting there in these weeds, in the weed, and it's very attractive as a nursery and a feeding area. About 80 species of fish spawn in these mats, and this here shows flying fish nests. Flying fish make nests out of bubbles, and they sit amongst the mats here. Flying fish, baby flying fish, are beloved of other fish to eat. And what happens is, you've got baby fish hatch in here, the bigger fish lurk underneath it to eat the baby ones coming out of here, and bigger fish like this dolphin fish sit underneath them. So there's a sort of sequence of breeding, feeding and nurturing. You've got turtles. 4 species of turtles live on these mats. Green turtles, loggerhead turtles, hawksbill turtles and Kemp's Ridley turtles. And for a long, long time, all one knew about turtles was they come up to the beach, they lay their eggs, and then they hatch eventually. The baby turtles get down to the sea and then they disappear. They disappear, excuse me, for years. Where do they go? Well, the answer, some of them at least, is they go to the Sargasso Sea. And they sit there on these mats. Not only do they sit there eating all the food they can get hold of, but because the surface water here is trapped above this film, it's about a degree warmer than surroundings, so it slightly warms up the turtles and they grow a lot faster than they would do in the open ocean. There are about 20 odd species of seabirds feed on these mats. This is a regal tern, and 2 species, the sooty and the bridal terns, even roost on the stuff. So here we are, we've got a unique community. Underneath it it's more or less the same as the midwater anyway. The water depth here is about 4,000 to 5,000 metres. These are the midwater animals I used to spend my life working with. They're absolutely wonderful. And these are the sorts of things that occur more or less everywhere in the ocean. This is a swordfish. It's got a satellite tag on it, and it's going up and down, vertical migration by day and night, coming up to the surface at night, and then daytime it's living at about 700 metres. Down at the bottom, it's a sort of muddy ooze, and it's sort of little beasties like this. Sargassum weed falls down to the bottom, gets eaten, and in that case you can use it as a bait for a baited camera trap, which is what's going on here. But to the north of our area, there's a whole load of extinct volcanoes, means seamounts. And there's a whole ridge of them here. It's called the Corner Sea Rise here. And these are fascinating things because they're in the middle of the abyssal plain. They poke up from the bottom, and they all have their own endemic populations of invertebrates, fish, and whatever growing on them. Soft corals like this. This is an exotic starfish type thing, and there are estimated to be 200 to 300 undescribed endemic species on these seamounts. And then it's also a centre for things moving into and out of it. All sorts of rare animals move through the Sargasso Sea. We've got bluefin tuna here. This is a leatherback turtle here. Humpback whales go to and fro on their way up from the further south up to the subarctic. This is a poor beagle shark with a satellite tag. It's tagged off Canada, comes all the way down to the Sargasso Sea where it gives birth to its young. And the most iconic in and out, so to speak, are the eels. Both the European and the American eel have their only known spawning area in the Sargasso Sea. And the eels come from Europe, from Iceland down to Morocco, into the Sargasso Sea. The American ones come from the rivers in Canada and the USA, and they meet somewhere in the Sargasso Sea, and somewhere in the Sargasso Sea they spawn. Eels are fascinating. I can talk for an hour on eels, but I'm not going to. But they have a fascinating life story. The eel, this is a silver eel. Silver eels head off into the Sargasso, into the Atlantic. They spawn somewhere. They lay eggs, and these hatch to things called a leptocephalus larva, which is this chap up here. In the European eel, they're a sort of inch or two long at the most. And all this is completely transparent. You can see all the different muscle bands in it. And everything else is all at the front end here, mouth, guts, and everything else. This leptocephalus larvae go from the Sargasso Sea, using the Gulf Stream, all the way up to Iceland, down to Morocco. They don't care where they get to because genetically it's exactly the same population all the way down. So they're not like salmon coming back to original rivers. When they get to the continental slopes, they metamorphose into these chaps. These are glass eels, and these are a few inches long. These change into elvers, which look like baby eels. They swim up into the rivers and turn into yellow eels. These are the ones that live in the rivers. They can stay in the rivers for 20 or 30 years. And then they, for some reason, decide it's time to go and have some fun. And they head off to the Sargasso Sea to breed. And on their way there, they turn into silver eels. And they lose all of their internal organs. They lose all their digestive system and whatnot. And all you're left with is a bag of sperm and a bag of eggs and a lot of muscle propelling them out into the Atlantic. It's amazing. And for years, ever since a Danish scientist worked out that they were coming from somewhere in the Sargasso Sea, people have been trying to sort out precisely where they go and how they get there and whatever. And this is a satellite, a tagging experiment done over 5 years by the European Commission scientists. And what they did, they tagged 700 female silver eels from all the way down from here to here. They set these going in September, each of them with a tag here. And the tag measures the depth, the light, and the temperature. And they're programmed to be released in certain time intervals. So after a while, they would pop up, go to the ocean surface, and the information would be picked up by Argo satellites. So there we go. 700 started off. Only 30 made it to the continental slope into the deep water. And of those 30, only one got to the Azores. And that had been going for 280 days, I think, and had swum 5,000 odd kilometers. It's something like that. And the data sort of posed as many questions as answers. What it seemed to clearly show was the eels didn't head straight for the Sargasso Sea at all. They came down here. And I thought about that for a bit, and I know a bit about oceanography, and that seems to me to be entirely sensible. What they seem to be doing is getting into the Azores current and the Canary current, which, if you remember, are doing that. So they're hitching a ride. I'll bet you that's what they're doing. You would, wouldn't you? And then, getting from here, they've got an awful long way to go to here. And that's another problem, because they were released in September, which is when they leave the rivers, and the supposition was they bred in the Sargasso Sea in December. Well, there's absolutely no way they're going to get there. Possibly this is because they're weighed down by the tags, but that seems a bit unlikely. Possibly the theory is all wrong, and it's not just a single annual cycle, but on the other hand, they're not feeding. So what on earth's going on? And I pondered for this for a bit, and I thought, well, maybe they're not doing it over here at all. Maybe they're doing it down here, on the way, and spawning somewhere in the current system, which is then taking the leptocephali larvae round and back up, and the European ones come back up this way, the Canadian ones go back up that way. And I was expounding this theory to a German eel scientist. Next thing I knew, he published a paper. And to be fair, what he was doing was publishing his latest research where he was actually out there catching them. And this shows where they were. This is where they were catching them. And if you remember that thing called the subtropical convergence, that is where they were. This is more or less where it is, and they sit in the temperature fronts created by that convergence system. To my delight, they're also found much further east than they're supposed to be. So I was quite pleased about this, but I can't claim to have solved the riddle of the eels. All I can claim to do is I thought about it. But it is still the case that people have been trying for over 100 years to catch an adult eel in the Atlantic Ocean, and no one has yet done it. No one has yet found them spawning. One imagines there must be a big concentration of them spawning somewhere. Who knows? No one's ever seen it. And how do they get back? These are tiny little things, about an inch long, and they go thousands of kilometers, turning and metamorphosing when they get to the other end. It is truly astonishing. Believe me. Okay, so we've got a unique ecosystem. We've got lots of rare animals. That in itself is good, is a pretty good start to why this area is important for conservation purposes. But it's not the only thing. The Sargasso Sea has been the centre for some real advances in global oceanography ever since the days of the Challenger. This is HMS Challenger in the 1850s, I think, 50s, so 70s. It's an ex-Navy boat. It started the science of oceanography. It was British, went around the world, did all sorts of exciting things. And that's it in Hamilton in Bermuda in 1870s. This is William Beebe and Barton, his engineer, in the bathysphere. And in this, they went down and actually saw live deep sea animals and gave the first broadcast from the deep ocean from that thing. And it is appalling. You can see this thing, and indeed you can climb in it. And it's about that diameter, with a hole like that. How two people that size got in it, I've no idea, but they did. Here is another colleague of mine and others in the room, John Swallow, with a big float. John discovered things called the ocean weather using these float systems. These are the eddies, like the atmospheric gyres and whatnot. It's the same in the ocean, except the scale is smaller. And they were discovered in the Sargasso Sea. And then you've got these blue blobs. This is one of the most important organisms on the planet, and you've never heard of it. It's Prochlorococcus. It's a photosynthetic bacteria. It's each one is about a diameter of about 1/100th of a human hair diameter. They're pretty small, you cannot see them. But they were discovered in the Sargasso Sea, and they're collectively now called picoplankton. And their importance is because they produce between them about 20% of the atmospheric oxygen that we breathe. So if you put it another way, 1 in every 5 breaths that's been going on in this room has come from these things, which were first discovered in the Sargasso Sea. So we've got all these exciting things going on, and then we've got the time series. And this is absolutely crucial. If you want to measure change, you need a base point, you need a starting point against which you can measure change against. And in the Sargasso Sea, an American oceanographer established a time series. I think it's called Hydrostation Air, says Bermuda. And it was a sort of an array of measuring instruments, measuring temperature and salinity every fortnight throughout the year. And it is still going on, giving the same data every fortnight throughout the year. And that data has shown us what's going on in the global ocean as a whole in terms of climate change and whatnot, which we'll talk a little bit about in the future. So, we've now got an interesting ecosystem. We've got a unique ecosystem. We've got lots and lots of rare and endangered animals. We've got important breeding nursery type areas. We've got an important area for global research. So what's the problem? Well, the problems are things like this. These are a list of potential threats. Some are real, some are a bit imaginary, but we can look at one or two of these. And seamount fisheries is this one. If you remember, the seamounts are on the top end of the area we're talking about, covered with all these lovely corals and fish. Unfortunately, the Spanish and Russians rather like these things, which is a fish called Alfonsina. It's a sort of red sea bream animal. And between the 1970s and the 1990s, they trawled these seamounts. There you are. There's a commercial trawl coming up full of these things, and that's what it looks like after they've finished. Then there's the long lining for tuna and that sort of thing. This is our area here. This is Bermuda here. All these squiggly blue things are individual long line fishes. They're all, you know where they are, they all have signals now which tell them their positions. That is, unless they turn them off, which they do occasionally or often. And the numbers of these has been steadily increasing coming from the east. So all these blue things are where long line fisheries is going on. And then there are eels. I love eels. The eel populations in both Europe and America have collapsed completely, so they're now regarded as endangered. The reasons for that are not obvious at all. There was undoubtedly overfishing on the continental slopes. There's a nasty Japanese parasite that somehow got into the Atlantic, which affects their swim bladders and possibly affects them getting to and fro. We build dams in rivers to get in the way of them, and so on and so forth. And it's also the possibilities of climate change. And if you remember the North Atlantic Oscillation, the major crash in eel populations happens just after the switch from a positive to a negative NAO index, which meant that the westerly winds were taken further south, which meant that the baby eels missed on their way back. And then you've got smuggling. And smuggling is for these chaps. These are the glass eels. And again, this was a Daily Telegraph 5 years ago. And they've got this estimate here that these earn about £32 million per annum from illegal exports to Asia. They go to Asia because the Japanese, the Chinese and the Koreans love eating eels, and you cannot rear them. You cannot rear them because you can't keep the leptocephali alive. No one really knows what they feed on. But once they get to this stage, you can, and you can rear them in eel farms and whatnot. And that's where they're heading for. And this is the sort of thing that happens. Here we are, glass eels, handfuls of them. You can get an awful lot of glass eels in a plastic bag. And you put the plastic bag in a suitcase, or in a briefcase, or anything like that, and you go on your aeroplane, and you drive over to Canada, not Canada, China, Japan, or whatever, and they're sold for vast amounts of money. And this is what they finish up with. They're actually delicious, but I shouldn't say that. But so you've got smuggling of glass eels is really getting in the way of recovery of these things. And then you've got this, plastic. There's so much plastic floating around in the world's oceans these days that in area it's been described as the seventh continent. It all comes from land. This is a beach in Bermuda. It gets broken down by wave action, by ultraviolet light into smaller and smaller bits. When it gets to about 5 millimeters, it starts to be called microplastics. And it gets tangled up in the Sargasso weed, or you can catch it in the ocean by using these surface nets, and this is the sort of thing you get. And a few years ago, I was asked to go to Brussels and give a talk on plastic and the Sargasso Sea. And just before I went, I was absolutely delighted to see this paper appear. And this lady here was the first person to actually try to estimate the amounts of plastic going into the ocean. And the numbers are quite staggering. It was estimated that something like 275 million tons of plastic waste was produced every year, and somewhere between 4 and 15 million tons gets into the ocean. This figure of 8 somewhere in the middle of that. And there's been, and I do need to actually look at my notes at this point, because there are some more numbers coming at you. Yes, here we are. And the authors estimated that they were using, this was data from 2010, which is the most recent they'd got. They said it was going to increase by an order of magnitude by 2025, which in case you know is now. Whether it has or not, I don't know, because I haven't seen any more recent numbers. But there are other estimates buzzing around, like the amount of plastic floating around on the surface. It accumulates in the ocean gyres, and it accumulates in the Sargasso Sea. And the latest estimate I have for that is there's about 60,000 tons of this stuff sitting in the Sargasso Sea, where it goes round and round and round in the jar, just sitting there. And what does it do? Well, you've all seen pictures like this. Plastic bags. Turtles like eating medusa and siphonophores, which are gelatinous colonial things, and this poor old turtle mistook that for lunch. Whale sharks swallow them and whale sharks just swim along with their mouths open, and they take in plastic bags. Whales, this one had 30 odd in, including Walker's crisps, and this seabird here, which is some sort of petrel, obviously had a bad lunch that day. And these are the sort of obvious impacts that you get from plastic waste. But then you've got the other sorts of impacts. Some animals quite like plastic. Goose barnacles will happily settle on a blob of plastic and drift around the world's oceans. Fish will like sheltering in any big bits of plastic that are sort of thrown into the sea, and they sit in these things, and these are these two unfortunate fish which have been eating microplastics here. And microplastics are eaten or ingested by everything up from plankton to fish. And it's a problem, but it's a problem which is not yet well understood. Plastic is full of fairly noxious chemicals, PCBs to name a few, and various other poisonous chemicals. And on ingestion, these are released. What's the impact of that? what happens in the food chain. Do you get bioaccumulation? That's what I'm searching for. Do you get bioaccumulation of these poisons in the fish going all the way up to the food chain? And selfishly, of course, we're most interested in that if it finishes up on our plate. And the other thing that's happening is the ecosystem of the plastic itself, and it's called the plastisphere. And this is a layer of plastic, and it's covered with bacteria. And these bacteria eat the plastic. And that's good news, you say. Well, it might be. The trouble is, when it's broken down by the bacteria, what happens to the chemicals? What do they do in the environment? And there's an awful lot of research going on nowadays about what is the impact of plastic, how harmful is it, how detrimental is it to the ecosystems, and selfishly ourselves. I don't have the answers, and I don't think anybody else does yet either. But it's a problem. And then we've got ships. Sargasso Sea is, one of the most frequently transferred shipping routes in the world. And you've got big ships coming along, noise, collisions, accidental discharges, all that sort of stuff presumably has an impact somewhere. And then I said right at the beginning of this, sargassum is characteristic of the Sargasso Sea. And then this happened. In 2011, on the coast of Sierra Leone, there was a massive deposition of millions of tons of sargassum weed. It was found first off Sierra Leone, and it was then found later in the same year off the mouth of the Orinoco. So what's going on? This isn't supposed to be here at all. This is not like the Sargasso Sea stuff. And it isn't coming from the Sargasso Sea at all. There's the Sargasso Sea. There's the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I guess that should be called the Gulf of America now. But and this stuff is all coming from here. And what is believed to have happened is that in the year 2010, just before the inundation that you saw of Senegal, there was a change in the North Atlantic Index. And the belief is that winds changed direction and they blew sargassum weed from the Sargasso Sea into the West African upwelling system where there's lots of food. And what does it do when it gets there? It thinks to itself, it's Christmas, and it starts to grow. And sargassum weed can double in size every fortnight. And the reason it doesn't do it in the Sargasso Sea is because there are no nutrients there. So in the Sargasso Sea you have this population of weed gently floating around doing nothing much in particular except existing. As soon as it gets a handle on some food, which is coming down the rivers in agricultural runoff from the Congo, from the Niger, from the Orinoco, from the Amazon, Sahara dust perhaps, climate change shifting things around perhaps, it grows and it grows. And it forms something called the Great Sargassum Belt, which is now tracked by satellites to give surrounding countries an estimate of when it's coming, when it's going to hit their beach, and how much of it there is. And you've got various pictures going on here. This shows this is where it all started, and then it's happened almost every year since, except 2013. The maximum amount was in this year here, which happens to be this, and it was estimated then that there were 20 million tons of this stuff. And that is a gross underestimate, because the satellite only sees what's right at the surface. It doesn't see anything 6 inches below it. So, 20 million tons times, you think of the number. And these show the development of the Sargassum Belt either throughout one year or in different years. And it forms the Sargassum Belt here. And what happens, various universities and agencies in the United States and around the world are looking to see when it's going to hit the beach to give the locals some sort of warning, because this is what happens. It hits the beach. And it, on its way, it destroys the local fisheries. It destroys the coral reefs because it blankets them. It destroys the tourism. I was rung up by a reporter from, I don't know, I think it was the Times, in about 2011, 2012, who was very indignant. Her holiday had been ruined. And it was my fault, of course, but she wanted to know, what was happening and what could be done about it. And I said, well, it's doing what nature does. It's making the most of a food source, and until you stop pouring chemicals into the water, agricultural runoff, that is what will happen, and that is what has happened ever since. And it really is an environmental and a socio-economic disaster for the Caribbean islands, for the Mexican coast and whatnot. It is ruining people's livelihoods, and it has other sorts of nasty tricks. When it begins to rot and dry out, it produces hydrogen sulfide, which is pretty nasty stuff. And because it's a brown algae, they do all sorts of interesting things too. This one accumulates arsenic, which puts a downer on using it for animal food or whatever, unless you can, process it somehow. And there's an awful lot of work going on in these islands and the coast around the Caribbean, trying to find a way of stopping it hitting the beach in the first place, or what do you do with it when you've got it. When you clear it up, the heavy machinery you do, that squashes all the turtle nests that may have made there in the first place. So, it is a disaster. And frankly, there is no end in sight. And it's a very difficult argument. It's all very well me standing up at meetings, which I used to do, saying, we've got to protect this stuff, and people who are in this sort of situation saying, for God's sake, why? You must be mad. There we go. And then we've got climate change. And this comes from the canary in the coal mine, which is that time series station in Bermuda. And this is the early data coming from that from the 1950s, and it shows you that the ocean is warming and that the acidity of the ocean is increasing. And there is so much more recent data than that on graphs which are full of biochemistry, and I don't understand it, but basically the trends are the same. It is still going on. This, of course, is not specific for the Sargasso Sea. It's what's happening in the global ocean as a whole, but it's in the Sargasso Sea where you can see it best because of the time series station. So, what are we doing about all of this? Well, first of all, when I was asked to do the science case, I went with an international lawyer, with David Freestone, who some of you know. We had to go and talk to the Foreign Office in London because Bermuda is an overseas territory and the Foreign Office likes to know what's going on there. And we went to the Foreign Office and said, well, we've got this great idea of devising, establishing how important the Sargasso Sea is and thinking of ways to conserve it. And they said, okay, that sounds fine. It meets our green agenda that we've just got. But there are three conditions. One, do nothing to embarrass Her Majesty. Second, we're not going to give you any money at all. And the third one was, write a science case that we can understand and support it with more detailed information. So that's what I spent the next year or two doing. We produced the summary science case. This is the readable document beloved by the diplomats, and that was approved by the governments of Bermuda and the UK. And I had a decent address book in those days, so we had all these people all contributing to this. And these are the 12, I think, 12 subsidiary more detailed reports to back this up. So we did that, and that is still the basis for the science case of the Sargasso Sea, because it hasn't really changed much since then, apart from the sargassum. We did other things then, and then we went off and got a thing called an EBSA. We got it, the Sargasso Sea, we made the case for it to be considered an ecologically and biologically significant area. This is a criteria established by the Convention of Biodiversity, who had a series of 7 questions which an area had to meet in order for them to consider it worthy of conservation. We sailed through that at ease. In fact, our proposal said it was the best EBSA proposal I'd ever seen. So we did that. We've done chapters in the United Nations World Ocean Assessment. We've done 2 of them so far. There's a 3rd one, I believe, on the go. We've written lots of scientific legal papers, and we've done endless presentations to bodies all over the world about this sort of thing. And then you get nowhere if you're trying to, persuade governments or whatever that you need to do something. The first thing they want to ask is, how much is it going to cost us, or how much are we going to lose if we don't do something? So you have to provide them with some sort of estimates of the resources that are there that they may be losing. So we commissioned a report which came up with a sort of numbers like this. The numbers are not accurate, but they are generally speaking in the right area. And the important thing is they're all very big. You've got numbers about fishing. You've got numbers about whale watching, with the whales going to and fro. You've got the revenues from the eel fisheries. You've got turtle watching. You've got sports fishing. Then you've got all the unquantifiable things like how much carbon is the Sargasso Sea, laying down for us. What is the value of all these strange animals that live there? How do you quantify that? So, again, we did this a few years ago, and it's still the best shot at the values in the Sargasso Sea that exists. And we managed to get a moratorium, marine mammal sanctuary established, going all the way up from south of Bermuda for the humpbacks that migrate up from the south, up into the Arctic where they feed, come back down north again to give birth. And we did that. This is the North Atlantic Fishery Organization. It's one of the fishery commissions. This one happens to have an area covering the corner of seamounts, and we did actually persuade them to put an embargo on trawling over their seamounts. So that is one of the one cogent things we have actually achieved. They have stopped doing it. Here we've got ICAT. These are the ICAT squares. ICAT stands for the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. Conservation is a very odd word for a fishery organisation who's basically trying to catch every single tuna in the ocean, but there we go. But again, we're making great strides with them. They have now recognised that Sargassum is a critical habitat for the fish they catch. We have now persuaded them to do some ecosystem modelling when they're developing their catch sizes or whatnot. So progress is being made. We drew up pretty pictures, posters and whatnot for seamen on ships. If you're going to and fro on a ship, they like to know what's going on around them. So we provide them with this sort of thing so they can identify the sorts of things going on outside their porthole. And we were given a prize. And I'm delighted to see this bit here. It was given by the a US organisation called the Seakeepers Award, and somewhere up here it's an awarded for outstanding individuals. So there you are. I'm an outstanding individual. But, and I was sitting at Padstow with my wife having a cream tea, and I got a telephone call. And it was from this gentleman here, David Shaw, who's an entrepreneur, one of the entrepreneurs who backed us. And he said, I've been contacted by the Seakeepers. They want to give me this award. And I'd said to them, no, it can't come to me. It's got to come to the Sargassum Alliance Committee, who's done all the hard work. And he said, would I be happy to accept this reward? Well, I agonised for a while over my scone and whatnot before saying, yes, that's not a bad idea. And we turned up at San Francisco Yacht Club in 2013 or 14. And we were given this splendid blue dolphin. It's very, very heavy, and now sits in David Freestone's office. But it was nice to be recognised. It's a curious mixture of people who've got this. Mikhail Gorbachev is one, Cousteau is another, Sylvia Earle, one of the doyens of biological oceanography, is another, and now it's us. And then in 2014, we actually got governments to take a notice. And we had a meeting in Hamilton in 2014 to establish something called the Sargasso Sea Commission. And we had governments agreeing for the first time to recognise that the Sargasso Sea was an area of sea which was worth conservation. They agreed they would do what they could to conserve it within the present constraints of life as far as they were concerned. But the point is they recognised its importance. And it's grown since then. It appointed commissioners, and the commissioners were put forward by the signatory countries. In those days there were 4, and then appointed by the government of Bermuda, and I was the first chairman of the Sargasso Sea Commission. So we were very pleased with ourselves, and we had a party. This is a Gombe man. It's the only time I ever saw them in Bermuda. But they dress up occasionally like this as dancers, wearing these extraordinary costumes which have echoes of their history in West Africa and slavery and that sort of thing. And it's a very spectacular show, and I can say the Premier of Bermuda cuts a fine dash on the dance floor with these. So I came to the end of my stint as a commissioner in 22. And in the last years of what I was doing, apart from going around talking to people and groups, we put together 2 very large, by our standards, projects. One funded by the Global Environment Facility called the Sargasso Sea Project, and one funded by a French organisation linking us with the Costa Rica Dome. And essentially both of these things were to develop the science case and to develop a strategic plan with the stakeholders who were involved in this, socio-economics. We were trying to bring it all together so that when the time came, if the time comes, we would have a plan for doing something for these areas. And whilst we were doing all of this, the United Nations had been getting to grips with what are we going to do about biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. They changed the A for the B. So in the high seas, what can we do about anything in the high seas? And they started talking about this seriously in 2017, and then in March 2023, they came up with a treaty, which they'd agreed. And it was a treaty done in March 23, and the aim of it is to make it possible to protect 30% of the high seas by 2030. The treaty covers 4 areas: marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, environmental impact assessments, capacity building, transfer of technology. And that's where it stands, because yes, they've got the treaty. To ratify it, to enact it, requires ratification by at least 60 member states. And that's where we are. We're waiting to see what happens.
Every spring, humpback whales migrate from their breeding and calving grounds in the West Indies and head north through the Sargasso Sea to the plankton-rich waters of their feeding grounds in the US and Canada. But the Sargasso Sea is far more than a transitory corridor on the whale's northward journey. Andrew Stevenson, a Bermuda-based researcher, has gained unique insights into the pelagic lives of these majestic creatures. Over 12 years, he has identified 1,500 individual humpback whales in Bermuda alone. His data reveals the high seas are as critical to these iconic animals as their feeding and breeding grounds. It is vital for the success of this species that an area so crucial for their life cycle is protected. With the government of Bermuda, in 2012, the Sargasso Sea Commission worked to designate the Bermuda Exclusive Economic Zone as a marine mammal sanctuary and launched a sister agreement with the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary in the USA. By collaborating with Andrew's Cetacean Project in Bermuda, the Sargasso Sea Commission continues its stewardship role of this unique open ocean ecosystem.
Well,
That's the Sargasso Sea.
thank you, Howard.